Welcome! It is book club edition of Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. We are working our way through Teach Your Own by John Holt and Pat Farenga. So this week we will be focusing on chapters 4 through 6. My name is Meagan and my fabulous co-host is
Amanda.
Excellent. And we are recording this on a Monday. We're getting the brain to start braining, right? Does anybody else start their Monday off in that sort of position?
Still trying to wake up.
I know, still getting things going. It's interesting, even as homeschoolers where we have an atypical, there's still something about a Monday sometimes, isn't there?
Mondays. And then we live in Southern California. Well, I think you're having some kind of gross weather too. But there's May gray and June gloom, and it makes it so much harder, right? The marine layer, the overcast, and then you're just like,
I can relate to that because I grew up where there was winter, and I don't even think when I was a teenager seasonal affective disorder existed, but I just remember feeling like a noodle for the entire winter and just feeling so uninspired and so everything. And then later realizing that seasonal affective disorder was a thing, and I was like, that explains why I had to leave the minute I was done with school. I was like, that's it, I'm out of here. I need to go somewhere where there's sun and warm, and I couldn't do it. It was too much for me. So yeah, so I'm sorry that it's gloomy because I totally get how that affects a person.
Yep.
So, Amanda, do people have to read the book to listen to the book club episode?
No. If you would like to read the book, if you listen to us talk about it and you're like, yeah, that's totally my jam, I want to learn more, by all means, go read it. But this is your chance to not have to actually read. You can be listening to the book club episodes like in the back while you're folding laundry or making dinner or whatever, and you don't actually have to try to like wade through all of the stories and the references and all of that. You can listen to us ramble about what we thought it meant.
Yeah, exactly. And then if there's so many points that in our discussion that you're like, I agree with that, I agree with that, I agree, oh, that's so fascinating, I never thought about it that way, maybe you do want to read the book, but you don't have to read all of them. We've got a whole slew of books lined up that we want to read. Some of them, neither one of us have read. Neither one of us have read this book. The next one I've read, but Amanda hasn't. So we'll kind of bop around and kind of recommend things that we've enjoyed and that we want to explore as a group. And so feel free to follow along. We totally understand the busy life setup. So do not feel bad if you do not read the book. We're here to fill you in on what the book says. Yes. So we had some pretty good conversation about the introduction materials of the book, the foreword, the introduction, etc., and chapters 1 to 3 in our last book club episode. And this week we are talking about chapters 4 through 6. And I found that it was a big difference from the initial section of reading. I feel like last week's book club discussion, there was a lot of facts in that reading and a lot of referencing studies or referencing specific things that I could really sink my teeth into as the justification or the reason why something behaves the way that it does. Mm-hmm. And in this section of reading, I made the note that I felt like there was more anecdotal in this section. It was like, so Susan in Michigan homeschools her kids, and Susan's doing great and her kids are doing great. I'm like, that's awesome, right? But I've been homeschooling for 10 years. I have my own success stories. I don't need to get them from a book. So if you're looking for that sort of validation and examples from a book, dig in chapters 4 through 6. There's plenty of stuff here. But for me, those stories weren't as helpful because for me, through my years of homeschooling, my nervousness about not doing enough or not preparing my kids enough or am I doing the right thing has vanished because I've seen it work time and time again. And each time I see it work, it kind of cements another layer on the foundation of the fact that this was the right choice for my kids and that they're going to be amazing. So other people's anecdotal stories are cool and I enjoy reading them. That's fine. But they weren't as meaningful to me as the first section.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Your overall thoughts section in our notes are much better than mine. Mine was, why does this section talk so much about farming? And it's two parts. Like one, isn't really reassuring for those of us that are planning for college and more traditional careers, right? And two, I grew up in a farming community and I work really hard to get really far away from that. So I was kind of like, why?
If homeschooling equals a return to farming, which, hey, if your kid wants to farm, that's awesome. And if you've got a legacy family farm and your kid's planning to take, that's awesome. But it's not a direct correlation between homeschooling and farming. There's plenty of avenues you can go into.
Yeah, right. You don't have to be like, hey, we're going to homeschool. So now we have to go buy a farm so the kids can work on the farm. Like, no, it's not.
I saw a reel the other day, and I saw it on Instagram, and I actually saved it to share on our social media stories, but I hadn't gotten around to it. It's in my inbox, and it's a satirical view on homeschooling. And it's this woman, and the kids are all dressed very plainly. And, she says, my husband and I own a 50-acre farm in the middle of nowhere because we're afraid of the government. And each month we walk the 27 miles into town to stock up on supplies. And it's just this absolutely hysterical. And it's not a mean-spirited satire on homeschooling. I found it hilarious. So I was like, I'm totally saving this to share. But she went on and hit kind of these high points that were absolutely hilarious. But yeah, there's a reason it's satire, is because some people do choose to live like that way. And if that works for them, that's awesome. But you don't have to. You can do whatever you want. Yeah. So I think you've got some notes on 53 and 54 that are earlier than my first note that I took down. What were your initial thoughts there?
So on page 50, there's a story about a kid who gets a poor grade, or has poor grades in school, traditional public school, not because they don't know the stuff. They know all of the stuff, and they're choosing not to attend class and sit through the class and the lectures. And that actually really hit home for me. It reminded me specifically of, right, just talking about a more traditional path. So when I was in university, I got a degree in liberal arts, but one of the requirements was that I take a few science classes. So I did chemistry, but I had enjoyed chemistry, and in high school I went all the way through chemistry and actually had like an internship in high school and that kind of thing. So I signed up for chemistry at the community college and transferred those credits. My school did not look at the grade, so I didn't actually care about the grade. I just needed the credit to be a passing credit from community college to transfer into my private university. And it made my community college professor so angry. And in hindsight, like I'm an adult now and I can see where they were coming from. But he was just like, I can't give you an A because you won't come to class and you get all of the assignments right and you show up on test day and you have the best score in the class. But your grade is terrible because, like 30% is based on attendance or something, right? And he was just raging at me, and I was just standing there kind of like, yeah, I know, but I don't like,
I'm still not coming.
Yeah. Like that's cool. Like I need to pass, and I can pass without being here. Thank you very much. And so, yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, right? Like why is it so important to sit through things if that's not how you learn, or if you already know the vast majority of the information, and something as simple as, the ability to test out of this thing to be able to start the next kind of step. Why are we so insistent that you waste your time sitting through classes or lectures or seminars?
Yeah, my daughter actually had a similar experience. So she's a high schooler, but takes college classes. She attends a college virtually in Canada, and attendance is a portion of the grade. So her first semester at this school, she had not missed a single class. They were in the second to last week of the semester, I want to say, and she had finished her capstone project. It had already been viewed by her professor. It was okayed, the whole thing, all the way through. And the night before this, that was at the very end of the semester, our internet went out, and we do not have amazing cell service at our house. So if the internet is out, we're Amish until it gets fixed. Right? So we had a return date from the internet provider that was going to be after her class. So I drove her to the public library late that night. It was like 9:00 at night, drove her to the public library so that she could sit outside and at least send an email to her professor and say, hey, I can't make it to class tomorrow, et cetera, et cetera. It was a 4-hour class. So it's not like she could have just really sat at Starbucks. And really, there wasn't a point to it. She had finished her capstone project and her professor saw it and was like, I have no changes. This is incredible. She got the highest grade in the class. When she got her final grade, she had a 93, I think, for attendance. She got dinged for missing that day. And I'm like, well, she emailed you to tell you that she was going to be absent because her internet was out, not because she was on a cruise or something, right? And her capstone was done. So why? Right. But it was just one of those things. It was like, because this is the policy. And her school is amazing. I mean, she still did amazing in the class and all that kind of stuff. But as a super loosey-goosey homeschooler who questions the why of everything, I'm like, that made no sense to me. Yeah. So
No,
I can see that.
We're not loosey-goosey homeschoolers, and there's still, I'm like, the whole point of homeschooling is that we get to decide what matters to us. And so I find it really annoying when we, sign up for a class here or there, and they have all of these, like, you have to do this, and you have to submit this, and you have to do this many forum posts, and you have to, all of these things, like, you're literally like targeting homeschoolers and you're putting all of this out there. Like, I'm actually pretty sure that I get to decide what I require from my child. And I don't require that. That's like a lot of extra busy work. So no, thank you. That's
Exactly.
not actually the words I use. The words I use are much less appropriate. No, thank you is not usually what comes out of my mouth. We're just going to be upfront there.
Just to be clear.
Right. So the other point that I had written down was on page 54. And it kind of, it went along with this. And for me, so it's talking about kids who are cutting class. He's using the word truant a lot. I don't really like that verbiage or language, so I'm going to mostly skip that. But there's a quote that says, they do need and would probably welcome help in finding ways to use what they learn, which is, after all, one of the things the schools are supposedly for. And it kind of rubbed me the wrong way because yes, there are schools that are failing at doing that. There are schools that are not showing the point of what they're learning or helping them see how to use the things that they're learning and the skills they're learning in real life. But I do think there are plenty of schools out there and plenty of teachers out there who are helping kids see how it matters. You're learning this and this is how it matters, or these are, the connections that it takes. But even down to, high school shop classes and things like that. I don't think that all schools are bad, right? I think there are schools that are doing good things, and there are, art schools, and there are specialty schools, performing arts, and even now there are coding schools. There are all kinds of high schools. They're not all bad. And I know that we homeschool, and I know that I love homeschooling, and I think it's a great option for us, and I think it's a great option for a lot of people. But I don't want the rhetoric to become like all schools are bad and they're all doing a terrible job of this, and teachers suck and administrators suck, and because it's not true, right? We made a choice. We both made choices to do this, and we have our own reasons, and it's really good for us. And I think there are a lot of other people it would be really good for, but not all schools suck.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want that to become the rhetoric. And this really, I'm like, well, you're kind of making that. You're kind of ignoring the fact that not every school sucks.
Yeah. Well, the thought that I had with what you were saying too, because I didn't take a lot out of this early section in the reading. I didn't highlight much. I didn't have a ton of notes.
Mm-hmm.
I did a little bit later in these chapters, have a little bit more, but not so much here. But from your interpretation of it, which I appreciated a ton, I also think there's an element of privilege involved there where, of course, yes, we know not everyone can homeschool their kids, et cetera, but the other thing is too, we've all probably seen and heard people talking about their life's journey and their story where school was their safe space and school was their salvation and school was their security net for food, basic caring, basic needs, things like that. I saw an interview, I think it was on Netflix. It was an Oprah special with Viola Davis. And Viola Davis is just right. I watched The Help while pregnant, and that was the worst thing a pregnant woman could ever do, because it was not small tears. It was like ugly crying, right? She is just an incredible actress.
Mhm.
And I've seen her in other things, of course, too. But that was, I think, the first time I remembered seeing her in something. And so it's kind of the thing that's firmly implanted in my brain. And she was talking about growing up and her situation growing up and how desperate her childhood was, and how deeply entrenched in poverty they were, to the point that Oprah, who's always been this one who's like, we had an outhouse and we were so poor and this, that, and the other thing, right? Oprah was like, I thought I was poor. You grew up poor, right?
Mm.
And she talks in that special about teachers that made sure that she had clean clothing or warm clothing and things like that, and provided a safety net for her that she didn't have otherwise in her life. So I think too, I don't have those concerns. My children are fed. My children are clothed. You don't have those concerns. But there is that, and I didn't pick it up from the reading. I picked it up from your thoughts, right? That there is that extra element too of, it's a very privileged place to not need the school system in that way as well.
Yeah. No, that's so true, right? And that, I'm sure that'll come up at some point in other things. But yeah, that just kind of, that stuck out to me. I'm like, I don't like that point. But yeah, so we don't need to beat a dead horse. So you had a comment on page 60 that I was, I skipped like 15 pages of comments from here on out. So
I had some big sections with no comments as well. Yeah. It starts on the part that I really highlighted was on 60, but it starts on 59, and the section is called Controlling One's Time. And the long and short of it is that younger people have so little control over their own time. And there's adults in here talking about how cagey they get, and how uncomfortable it is to not have control of their own time. And it says on page 60, who can guess at the degree of personal alienation we as a society cause our children by structuring so much of their time for them? I am beginning to think the greatest harm is not in the what or the how of the structuring, but in the very fact that 5 days out of 7, 9 months out of 12, 6 hours out of the center of those days, we remove children from the responsibility of their time. And that's looking at a traditional school schedule, not to say that all homeschoolers are doing that. But I mean, we've seen the color-coded charts and all that kind of stuff that are out there as far as even homeschool days. Like the kids are up at 5 because days start at 5 a.m., right? And homeschool, we must be dressed and at the table by such and such a time. And if that's working for your family, that's awesome. But sometimes I often wonder if it's done because it's working, or if it's done because that's what's always been done, right? Because that's the mentality of school. And for kids to have so little agency over their time, their choices and things like that, it makes me sad, because if somebody did that to me, I would 100% feel cagey. And so I loved that there was an acknowledgement of that in the book, because our society has been structured around the fact that like kids can't be trusted with their own time. They won't do anything productive or whatever the case might be. And that's not really the case. There's plenty, as I started out with, there's tons of anecdotal stories in this section of reading where it talks about that it can. I mean, my own kids manage their time for the most part. So they have a lot of agency over their time. And so it can work. So I liked the fact that they acknowledged that in that section.
Yeah. Okay. I'm picking up what you're putting down. And the thing is that's a thread, right, that kind of continues to weave through. We saw a bit of it in the first few sections, in the first few chapters. And I have read ahead a little. And so you kind of continue to see this thread of thought and the different ways that it plays out, but it's still kind of that same idea, and the different ways that we see that and implement it and experience it with our kids. So
Yeah.
Okay.
I like it.
Nice.
What you got next?
There's a story about children having their own bank account, and it's talking specifically about how there's a 10-year-old who has her very own bank account, and it's not like a parental account. It's not an in-trust account. The parents have no say over what happens with the account. They went to try to do something with the account for her one day, and they couldn't because they weren't on her card. And that really kind of blew my mind. I'm curious what kind of accounts your kids have, because we have some accounts, but everything that we have, like we found it really hard to be able to set up accounts for a kid, and like he's an authorized user on one of my credit cards to help build history and also to just for airport lounge status, but that's a whole other story. And, he has an investing account, but it is one of those, it's an in-trust account set up under me. And so I was like, I wonder if it's a function of where we live or if there's there's been a change, right, between the 1970s and 80s and now and what you can get.
I would venture to guess that is the case because I'm assuming that there are good reasons for all the laws that are in place around kids and banking, but man, they are restrictive and they are so difficult. Yeah, so all three of my kids are entrepreneurs. They all have businesses. And my daughter was kind of the first one to have to deal with a decent enough chunk of money that we had to worry about how it was all structured. And they are so restricted in society that so for example, she has an LLC that is solely in her name, and that is where all her stuff goes through. She cannot open an LLC bank account because she's under 18. So she can have an LLC, but she can't have a bank account for her LLC. It makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
So my kids were able to we bank primarily at Chase, which I say begrudgingly because my 12-year-old has been begging me to stop banking at Chase because of their connections with climate change and things like that. But we've moved so often and they're everywhere. So it's just like, I don't have to start from scratch by using local banks every time we move for my husband's job. And so I'm still at Chase and contributing to climate change, which I feel terrible about saying. Chase has an account where kids under the age of 13 can get what they call My First Checking, and there's no fees or anything like that. So my kids opened that. My oldest two kids opened that. And it was the worst, most useless. You could only fund it from the parent's checking account or savings account that it was associated with. So my daughter gets paid from Instagram as an influencer. She gets paid from her Etsy shop. She receives nice, decent payouts. And don't you know, the first payout when she set up that account and she put it into Etsy, like, oh, I have my own account, I'm going to do this, etc. It was like a $2,000 payout. And it just didn't show up. And we had no idea where it was. And we had to do all these things. Come to find out, it can't take deposits from external accounts. It can only take deposits from my account. I'm like, well, that would have been really helpful information when we set up the bank account at Chase. Thank you very much. But
yeah,
no.
but what a useless account.
Right. It was
completely
useless.
The kids should be able to go in and deposit the money into their own account. Like that's, talk
That's
about,
the point.
Trying to teach your kid like real life skills. Oh, give it to, no matter what age you are, give your paycheck to your parent and then they'll put it in your bank account like these.
Yeah. So turn 13, they can get a decent, it's called a high school checking account. At least at Chase, that's what it's called. You have to be 13. So like the day she turned 13, she was like, I'm giving up this horrible debit card and I'm getting a real bank account. And so she has that. So yeah, they have bank accounts that are in their own names, things like that. But it is a struggle. There are some limits. The part that really frustrates me, so entrepreneurship has been really important for us. And I talked, I think in an earlier episode about my 10 soul crushing years in corporate America. That's if your kid wants to work in corporate America and and that environment suits them, that's awesome. It was the worst experience of my life. So I've wanted my kids to have entrepreneurial skills so that whatever they decide to do, they have the skills to go in any direction they want to. And they enjoy it. They enjoy having their own money. They enjoy having some authority over something. It's been really great for them to develop their speaking skills because they vend at farmers markets and things like that. So it's been a great learning tool for us, but there are plenty of things that they cannot put in their own name. And so from my perspective, from a tax perspective, having all their crap in my name is not, my husband is like, you have got to get this stuff out of our names, right? Like sometimes we hover very close to the next bracket in taxes. And they're like, if my husband's like, if her Etsy account puts us over the edge, I'm going to be pretty pissed. I'm like, I am too, right? I mean, I get a W-2, I think it is, or a 1099. I don't even know, from Meta every year for all of her Instagram payouts and whatever for her Instagram bonuses and stuff like that. I'm getting taxed for her stuff. I'm like, that's not freaking my stuff. Stop taxing me for it, right? Let her pay the tax. Let her have that lesson. Let her have that funding. And then she's still paying the tax, but now she's having to pay it at our tax rate, which also isn't fair to her. So yeah, our society, unfortunately, is not really built for kids. There's all these federal laws about kids and bank accounts and stuff like that. And I'm sure some of them were put into place to protect kids from parents who dip into their accounts and stuff like that. But man, it makes entrepreneurship hard for young kids. I mean, I don't say young. My kids are like 16 and 15. Like, they're not super young. If they weren't entrepreneurs, they'd be bagging groceries or, frying fries or whatever. They'd still be having an income. Our income just happens to come through that way for the kids. But it is not well set up for these kids to be able to handle their own money and to learn those lessons independently, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can see that. I can totally see that.
Yeah. So it kind of stinks. So, and I'm sure she'll be thrilled when she can stop paying our tax rate.
Right.
Get me off your taxes. Yeah. So it is definitely difficult there. Oh.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet. And we also don't focus on entrepreneurship. It's honestly not a strength of mine or my husband's. And our kiddo is like not interested. And it's a big thing, right? It is often a big thing in the homeschool community. There are all kinds of, like kid entrepreneur fairs and things like that. And I'm always like, oh, is there something you want to do? Like, I can read a book. I know people who are good at it. I can ask for help. I can, and he's one of those kids. He's always like, yeah, maybe. And then as he like starts working through it, and all the steps that go into it, he's like, never mind. I'll just do that for fun. Thank God. I mean, okay, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, exactly. I'll muffle my sigh of relief. Yeah, totally. I mean, for us, it's been awesome, but it's not for everybody, and that's okay. But it's not the red tape is there, that's for sure, when it comes to kids and entrepreneurship, which is a bummer. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say we both highlighted the same 2 pages, but we have different things that we got from it. So I'm curious.
And it makes me think that we're both talking about the exact same thing, because it literally. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it, right? The section is from the bottom to the top, and we both highlighted 68 to 69. So we must be talking about the same thing, but wrote down 2 completely different things that we took from it. So you want to jump into yours first, Amanda?
For me, I just what I got from this section was talk about how across all cultures, kids like to listen to grown-ups talk. And they, there's a story about hiding at the top of the stairs after they're supposed to be in bed, listening to the grown-ups talk. And I can remember eavesdropping at the door on, grown-up nights when my parents would have friends or relatives over. And we struggle with that a lot, right? So we only have one child. We live in a small, a 2-bedroom condo. And in our own home, we include him in a lot of things, right? And I think that's important. It's a parenting style. It's a choice, an active choice to include him in a lot of adults and current events and world events, and to treat him like a person who's learning. At the same time, there are times that's like, dude, you have to butt out. This is an adult conversation and it is not for you. And frankly, I need you to go into your bedroom and listen to an audiobook or do something so that I can have a conversation that is not for your ears. And we struggle with it too when we go to visit family, because we are definitely include the child more than it would necessarily be typical in my extended family. And so then we have a lot of times where the adults, the grown-ups, are trying to have conversations and he's trying to participate. And it's like, this is not the time and place. I'm sorry. This is not the time and place. Like, please go in the bedroom and do something. So yeah, that's what I took from it. Now, you took something totally different.
Totally different. So at the bottom of 68 and 69. So did yours come from the section that says speech and language in real life?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm like, maybe I wrote the wrong page number down. I don't know.
It's the same.
So the section that I wrote down was, there was this gentleman named Ivan Illich who wrote a book. His book was called Shadow Work, about vernacular values in education. And it says, he goes on to point out that all over the world, many poor people in non-industrial countries speak more than one language. A goldsmith he knows in Timbuktu speaks 6. And that, on the whole, is only in nation states that have had several generations of compulsory schooling that we find most people speaking only one language. For in these supposedly advanced nations, people no longer learn their languages from people who talk to them, meaning what they say in the context of everyday life, but from professional speakers who are trained and paid to say what others have prepared for them. And so it's just, I mean, the theme has talk about like weaving a thread through something, right? The theme of organic learning versus structured learning and how much can be kind of picked up, right? In our next section, there's a concept of finding out and kind of very exploratory learning. And so I think it's just kind of that thing that's really interesting. I know around the world, people talk about Americans and the fact how odd it is that we only speak one language for the most part, that there are a surprisingly slim percentage of Americans who speak a second language. And so I thought that's really, really interesting. I've heard Trevor Noah talk about language for so long. Like when you speak to someone in their own language, you're connecting on a level that transcends the words that you're using because there's a cultural understanding that's there. And I see it like with my own husband. My husband speaks multiple languages. If he's talking to somebody who also speaks, who speaks both Spanish and English, they can both speak English, and yet there they are talking away in Spanish. There's an understanding, there's a deeper understanding that connects through the language. And so I found that pretty interesting. And my own kids have been I have one kid who's language hungry, but the other two, not so much. And I think part of it comes from, at least with my oldest, part of it comes with perfectionism and being afraid to make the mistakes and being embarrassed about making the mistakes and things like that. So he understands every damn word you say, but he's never going to open his mouth and say something to you in the other language. Right. And so I found that pretty interesting. As just kind of a concept, like where did we go so wrong that our kids have kind of lost that willingness or the desire or that we've lost the need to connect with the rest of the world like that. I mean, we live in a society, if you're listening internationally, we live in a society where people are like, this is America. Why should I have to press one to speak English? Right. And so that's how far removed we are from the Goldsmith in Timbuktu. It's a really big disparity.
Yeah, no, it's true. I wonder how much of that has to do with the idea of the American dream that was so popular in the mid 20th century and how many immigrants came to the United States with the goal of achieving the American dream. And, so I mean, my husband is Asian and we have a lot of friends who are, first generation or immigrants. And a common story in their home was that they actively didn't speak their native language to their kids. They tried to make sure that they didn't learn that because they wanted them to live that American dream, right? And that was to speak English and go to the public schools and to be successful. So, like I wonder how much of that plays into it.
Yeah. And I think too, like even the people who've Americanized their names for easier pronunciation, easier spelling, things like that. So that you're probably right because we see that all the time too. There's a really powerful video, might have been a TED Talk event or something. It's the actress, her name is Uzo Amaka. She was in Orange is the New Black, and she was just in this really amazing thing that they had on Netflix called Painkiller, and it was about the opioid crisis in America. Really fast. I'm going to watch it with my kids because it's a really interesting limited series showing what the pharmaceutical company did to lie and cheat their way to get this thing approved. And then specifically fentanyl and OxyContin. And then the way people became addicted to it, that it wasn't always through the things that we might consider the stereotypical things that we might consider when we think of opioid addiction. So I told the kids, this is a busy week, but I'm like, next week we're going to start it. But anyway, this actress, Uzo Amaka, is in there, and her family's from Nigeria. And she went home one day and she said to her mother, can we just call me Zoe from now on? Can I just go by a nickname? And her mother said, why? And she said, well, nobody ever pronounces it properly and this, that, and the other thing. And her mother says, if they can learn to say Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky, they can learn how to say your name too. And she's like, no, we're not changing it. But that's, I think, not as common as the people who were like, well, I won't be Miguel anymore. I'll be Mike, or I won't be Giuseppe. I'll be Joe. Right. And to kind of assimilate and kind of remove some of those stereotypes that came with immigrant years and years ago. I mean, forget about years and years ago. We still have stereotypes and and Nation Against Immigrants in the United States today, in the land of immigrants. It's the most ironic thing ever.
Yeah, right. And I guess too, going another step, there's I also just saw a reel on Instagram, and it was a guy maybe from the UK, I don't know, UK or Europe, and he was talking about, like why so few Americans have passports.
Oh, I know that one.
And
I saw that one.
yeah, and he was like, come on, like get real. They have everything they could need on this giant continent. And it takes, 6-7 hours to fly from one side to the other. Like, why would you then take another 6 or 7 hours at least to fly across a massive body of water to go somewhere else? And, I suppose there's a lot of truth to that as well. English is the predominant language of the North American continent, if you're not counting in Central America and Mexico. And so, if you're traveling there where you don't need a passport to leave, and so few Americans even have passports to be able to travel to Mexico or to fly across to where you would need, French or something like that. I guess, yeah, I suppose from that regard, it makes sense as well. It's not like Europe where you've got a ton of languages in the same amount of space.
Yeah, you go 2 hours this direction or 2 hours that direction, and you're in a new language zone. But then to the point that they made in the first section of the reading is, why are we still requiring all these students to take 2 years of language, right? Like, what could we be doing with that 2 years of educational instruction? Either we double down and commit to learning languages and commit to broadening those horizons, or just drop the requirement to get into college because it's so silly. There is a small trend of that, though. So in South Carolina, my son was able to use coding language as his foreign language requirement or whatever, if you will. He was able to use technical language as part of that, which for people who want to go into the world of tech and coding and things like that, way more useful, meaningful use of that time. So that was pretty cool. He was able to kind of sidestep the language requirement in that way.
Yeah.
Which was pretty awesome. Yeah. And a pretty useful skill, which is pretty awesome too. Yeah. What do you have next, Amanda?
All right, so now we're into chapter 5. It's called
Woo-hoo!
Living in Working Spaces. And it kind of starts off right off the bat, and it's talking about the challenges of starting a school. And again, it's important to remember that this book is like early days of like, let's do school reform. And John Holt initially was about school reform, and then kind of realized that school reform wasn't working the way he wanted it to work, and so became a real proponent of homeschooling. And so he was talking about the challenges with trying to start your own school and saying, people always ask me, and I really think, like, just don't do it. Don't even try. And if you do, be really, really clear about what you're going to do, and that you're not having standards and curriculum and expectations, because then it's not what we're trying to achieve. And for me, I was like, that actually really makes me think about, so in California, we have a very robust charter school system. They're public school, and they don't follow exactly the same rules as a standard public school, but they do get funding, and you have a lot of the same, you still have the testing, and you can get your services and things like that. But at least in our community, many of those charter schools were founded 25 to 30 years ago. So probably kind of with this movement of, hey, let's see a real change in education. And they have these founding members, founding faculty. A lot of times the faculty moved up into the administrative role. And in the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of these charters that were doing really great things, and they're really good schools, their administration has retired, and the schools have super, super floundered, right? Like the old guard that was there and leading the charge on, hey, we have this amazing school, and we do world beat music, and we have sewing and art, and we focus on all of these cool things. And when they step down, They struggle so hard to find new administration, and teachers struggle with the changes, and the parents who were already there, like, this isn't the school that we signed up for. And of course it's not, right? I mean, when you bring in a new leader and you've had kind of a continuity of leadership of these founding members for 20 odd years, and then suddenly all of those original people are gone and you bring in new people, it's going to drastically change things, even when it doesn't drastically change things, if you know what I mean. And um, so the school that we were for a brief time affiliated with, they're struggling with this right now. I think they're on their third or fourth executive director, which is essentially a principal in a charter school, in like the last 3 years. And there was another one, the one that we moved. We bought a condo next to a school that we were going to go to, and they had the same thing. It happened, 2 or 3 years before we were going to go there, and I was like, I'm just not comfortable with what's happening, and they haven't found their new groove yet. And there's another one that's very highly rated, and I went with a friend and we went and toured it because we were thinking about trying to send our kids there together. They're good friends, and they were having the same thing, right? Their former executive director who was on the board was now back in the role of being the executive director temporarily and giving the tour as they tried to find a new executive director, because the last one had stepped down after like only being there for 6 months or something. And so I feel like it kind of all ties in, that there was that movement for, let's change the way we teach kids, and it was working, but it's hard to sustain it in a brick and mortar environment, right? So yeah, a total, aside, but I was like seeing how that all kind of plays in together and the connections. I'm like, oh, I just found that a really interesting kind of aha moment of like how much of this actually all fits together in ways that you don't really see. And then, you have people like me who are like, well, I loved this idea and I thought this was going to be great. And then, as it's not working anymore, like, well, I think it's better for us to just do homeschool. So we did a mini John Holt movement in our own home.
Well, and I think one of the things, I mean, when there's, in corporations, it's often referred to as regime change, right? Because it's massive upheaval when there's a leadership change in executives and things like that. Corporations have the money to bring in consultants and all this stuff to bring the culture back to a homeostasis and level the playing field and do what needs to be done. Schools don't have the money for any of that stuff. So when the teachers are feeling upheaval and the parents are feeling upheaval and all that kind of stuff, it's just going to be rocky. There's not going to be anybody who smooths that over. And corporations spend a fortune shifting culture and doing things like that. And our schools, unfortunately, just don't have it. I mean, none of our public services really do. I went to a town hall meeting the other day and the police chief was there. So it was like the beginning of May when I went to the meeting, and they ran out of funding for training for the police department. The end, it's out until the next fiscal budget passes over the summer. So, the people who really need training.
That's not a problem, right?
Yeah, no training, And so, they just, none of our stuff is funded to the degree that it really needs to. And whoever is associated with that organization is what pays the price, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true.
You have a note about the Boston Children's Museum. What happened at the Boston Children's Museum? Is this going to be a Yelp review? I'm here for it.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. And it plays into a lot of things actually in this section, in these chapters. So on page 4, it says, quote, we need safe, interesting spaces where children can gather. And he specifically mentions that Boston has a great children's museum. And so we went to the Boston Children's Museum before reading this book a few months back. My kiddo has a super active imagination, and he still absolutely loves a children's museum because it's a space where he's just supposed to go and imagine and try all kinds of different things. And that is 100% his jam. And museums are more open and welcoming. I'm going to give a shout out actually to the Fairbanks, Alaska Children's Museum. Of all the places, they didn't bat an eye when we brought our 10-year-old in to play, and all of the other kids there were toddlers and maybe early elementary. We were there on a vacation. We had some free time. We thought, it was freezing cold. So we thought this will be a place he can just go and climb and have fun. And he did. He had a blast. And they were so kind and welcoming. And they gave him a free chapter book when we left to read at the hotel. Like, it was great. Boston Children's Museum, not so much. The amount of judging and side eye. And I even had some parents come up and specifically ask that he not play at certain things while their kids were there, or ask that he, defer to the younger kids and that they be able to play with certain toys because he was too big and their kids should be able to play. And I was like, good golly. Like, that is not what I said, right? And far stronger words than good golly. But, just how sad, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's a children's museum and I've brought a child, and I'm sorry that you think 10 is too old to want to play, but he's allowed to play just the exact same. He was not being aggressive. He wasn't being hurtful. He was truly in his own world of made up, make believe stuff that is happening. And he's doing his own thing for the most part. And in fairness, there were a couple people. There was one time when he was building with truly maybe like a 3-year-old, and they were putting these big foam blocks together and building a house, and they were cooperating really well because the little guy couldn't put things up as high as he wanted, and my kiddo was helping, and they had a great time. But it's a big museum, and there were a lot of exhibits where it just did not go well, and I hate that, right? Because now I'm really like apprehensive about which children's museums we go to, and I like I want to have a plan to make sure that if we run into the Karens, it's like we have a plan so that he's not, I don't want it to bother him. I don't want it to impact him. And I would rather they come to me and be a bitch to me about it than be a jerk to him.
Right.
But I also
did he feel it at all or hear any of it? Did he know what was happening, or did he sense it?
I think he can be a bit oblivious about those things. So I don't think he picked up on it. And he was having a lot of fun for the most part. And I don't think he did. There was one instance where there was an adult that redirected him in a way that I was not okay with. But he just kind of rolled with it and was like, oh, okay, I'll go play with this other thing then, like there's so much that I want to do. And so he was off and doing it.
How sad.
Yeah.
And your kid too, like, not like, okay, so first of all, any 10-year-old should be able to go and play in a children's museum. But even still, like, even if he's physically bigger than the other kids, like, your child is he has like a small build. He's not like a big hulking, like brooding child, I mean, he's not an amazing figure when he's there. I mean, yes, he's taller, but he's got a gentle spirit and all of that. Right. I mean, ugh, how sad. Yeah, my kids, I made some notes too. There's a lot of stuff in here about, fantasy being minimized in comparison to real work, quote unquote, and things like that. And I had a number of notes, like especially between pages 83 and 85 about my kids. I mean, my 16-year-old, there's a thing on 84 about stick worlds. And my 16-year-old has this army of stuff. It's kind of this ragtag crew that's been picked up from all over the place. And they have names and voices and backstories. And I mean, they have birthdays, they have, and the whole family goes along with it. I mean, there's themes like, I mean, he's got this bear, Peppy, that he took from his sister. Actually, it was a whole thing where Peppy didn't want to live with Astrid anymore. And like, there were all these reasons he didn't want to live there. And so, I mean, we would be howling. And finally she was like, fine, Peppy can go live in your room. She was never super attached to him. I mean, it was just like it wasn't the same thing for her. And, I mean, Peppy will come to me some days and say like, can you give me a ride? And I'm like, sure, Peppy, where do you need to go? And he's like, I got to go to Legal Aid. I'm like, well, what do you need to go to Legal Aid for, Peppy? He goes, because I went to the all-you-can-eat sushi place and they wouldn't let me have as much salmon as I wanted to, and that's false advertising, so I need a lawyer. I'm like, okay, and he'll be like, I'd take my bicycle, but my bicycle got stolen somewhere the other day, and he's got this whole thing. And, I got fired from my job. One of the other stuff, he owns a sandwich shop, and so he was working at Bob's sandwich shop, but he got fired, and it's like a whole situation. This is a kid who's 16 and goes to college. Right.
Yeah.
And we still have these fantastical worlds that I'm like, I will be devastated if they go away someday because they are right. I mean, we absolutely love it. And so I love that. And then even on the next page, there was a thing where it talked about this family where the kids kind of created their own toys and things like that. And so years ago, my youngest son has Beyblades now. Are you familiar with those at all, Amanda?
Yeah, we learned about Beyblades in our very short time in brick and mortar school. Yes.
Okay, there you go. I think my son learned about them at co-op. And in the beginning, I was like, I'm not buying these things. Like they're cheap. They're like spinning tops and they break apart and you drop two of them into like what they call, I think it's an arena or a stadium or something. And they crash into each other and this, that, the other thing. So I didn't buy them. My boys built their own. They built them out of Legos and they got a giant salad bowl from my mom's kitchen. And that was the stadium. And they created this whole rule structure about who gets points if this happens and who gets points if that happens and all that kind of stuff. They literally, for a week, I didn't see them. I mean, they were so engrossed of this world of imaginative play that I was like, have the best time ever. I mean, they loved them. And they made them out of Legos. They were as happy as clams, right? And so I feel like there is that thing where society expects these kids to give all that up at a really early age.
Mm-hmm.
And why, right? I mean, look at Jim Henson. Like he was imaginative until the day he died. There's a movie coming out about him on Disney Plus that I'm super excited about because I love the Muppets. But, I mean, imagine this guy who's in his 20s and he's got a sock puppet on his hand. People must have thought he was nuts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a beautiful thing to be in touch with that imaginative side in that fantasy world for so long. I love it. I hope it never goes away.
No, that's it exactly. And I mean, the book talks about it, but in real life, we know as well, right? That people who and the research is there, right? I care about the research that people who indulge in imaginative play, the longer they do it, the more they do it, the more creative they are with thinking, the more outside of the box thinkers they are, the more success in life they have in general. And so, like, I would, like, we should all be able to get on board with that and encourage it. And I don't know how we fix that in schools, because I really do worry that until we can find a way to fix it in schools, those people who aren't in schools, those people 4% that aren't in a regular school, are going to really struggle to be able to continue to embrace it. And that's just really unfortunate.
Yeah.
Kind of in that same section, right? There's a section that talk about kids being overscheduled and the importance of taking time for play. And even though we're academic homeschoolers and we do a lot more, right? We have a lot of curriculum and a lot of classes and a lot of those kinds of things. I'm pretty hardcore about the fact that there's at least 2.5 hours and usually closer to 4 hours a day where nothing is scheduled.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is your time to play. This is your time to be bored. This is your time to figure out what you want to do. And that may mean that you grab a book and you lay in bed and you read. It may mean that you con your dad into playing a board game with you. But this is your time to be unscheduled and do with it what you want. And I just think that's so important, even if you are going to be a more structured academic homeschooler, to make sure that there's time for kids to have their own time and have to figure out what they do with it.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to what you were saying before, that the idea of control and kids controlling their time, and how that thread kind of weaves in and out of this book.
Yeah. So the last two notes that I see, right? Amanda and I keep kind of a side-by-side shared Google Doc with our notes for the book. And our last two notes line up identically, which I think is fantastic, that we're both approaching raising our kids and homeschooling so differently, but we both have very common ideas on some things. Well, page 88. Share, Amanda. What do you think?
All right. So this is a story of a pretty long section about cops and robbers, and that there's not a problem with gunplay and that kind of thing. And for me, that's just one of those things, like, no thanks on guns as toys. And it really, for me and in our home, it really does boil down to the fact that guns are made to kill. Right.
Mm-hmm.
A gun that's their purpose, whether it's to kill animals or people. There's no gun that's made just for target practice. A gun is made to kill things, and they're deadly weapons. Like, and we don't need to trivialize that, and we don't need to play with that. And he's 10 now, so I feel like he's less likely to to not, right? Like he's old enough now that he does understand. And so I suppose in the nearish future, we may see some kind of nerf something enter our household, or at least become part of something. But it'll only be, the nerf kinds that are truly nerf.
They look like toys.
Yeah.
There's foam,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because for me, it's important to know the purpose of things and to understand the significance of that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, what were your thoughts? I mean, you have, but
yeah. I literally just wrote down, still not sold on the idea of guns as toys, right? We've still never had a toy gun. We've never had a water gun for the pool. We've never had any of them. Listen, I eat meat, right? So I can't be against hunting and eat meat. I totally get that there are people who go out and I grew up in an area that the CDC had a Lyme disease study center set up because we had such an overpopulation of deer that Lyme disease was so rampant. I understand the need for population control and things like that. I get it. I love a good piece of breaded chicken. I mean, I'm not a hypocrite. So I understand the need for hunting and things like that. But I mean, in America, if you're listening from the other parts of the world, the other parts of the world look at us like, what on earth is with these people in the guns, right? It's just, it's out of control. Yeah. So for my kids, they've never had them. They've never had guns. They've never had toy guns. I mean, every once in a while I would see like a stick being used, like if they picked it up in the park and they probably just learned it from another kid or something, and we'd just say, that's not what that is.
And for anyone who's listening outside of the United States, it is important to note that we have a really unfortunate number of deaths where young kids pick up loaded guns in the home and shoot themselves or shoot someone else because they cannot differentiate. They don't know, and the guns have not been stored safely.
Right.
I come from a little bit of a different so when I was growing up, my dad was actually a deputy sheriff and a police officer at different times in my childhood. So we have my family, my extended family, we have a little bit of a different relationship with guns. My dad absolutely has some guns. I'm not sure where they are at this point. I think they're all stored well, and the few that aren't are actually family heirlooms from wars, like those kinds of some older guns like that. And I had mentioned before, he grew up on a farm, and so I think he might still have his dad's hunting rifle or something like that. And they're not, as far as I know. My dad doesn't, still go to the shooting range to keep up his skills or anything like that because he's retired from that. He's been an arson investigator for a long time. My brother works on a SWAT team. He's a paramedic on a SWAT team. So, that's a huge part of his life. And it's and there's the guns and gun rhetoric and gun beliefs and ideology and all of that stuff. It's especially complicated in the United States. And so, we won't go into that here. That's like a big hot button topic that doesn't need to be discussed in a John Holt book club. But, that for me, that's a big part of why for us in our home, we have this really clear line of, guns, they are a deadly weapon, and you need to understand that because they're, I said everything I need to say on that. I'll leave it there.
All right. And then our last note, both lines up again, page 93. And it's talking about young artists and people not necessarily respecting the artistic or creative drive that younger kids have. It's like, oh, well, that's a frivolous hobby or that's a frivolous interest. But that's, again, it's not real learning. It's kind of like imaginative play. It's not real learning. This is a distraction from the learning that we should be doing. And I am the parent of an artist who, kind of before Amanda, I forget if it was in this episode or our last episode, when you kind of like, okay, my kid's gifted. Like, it's a hard thing to say sometimes, right? Because you don't want to be like that mom, right? So I have kind of the same situation when it comes to artists. My child, I mean, not by me, by like multiple articles and publications and stuff, has been described as a prodigy. And that's been her life. That is her. She has gone all in with unschooling and art. And so for me, reading this and like the idea that there are other young artists who probably have similar passion and similar talent to what my kid has, but it's not being respected or elevated in that same way, it just made me sad because I I viewed it the way I would for my own kid. If she were to not have this component of her life, it would be so devastating for her and such a loss for her. So that was my big takeaway from that section. What was yours, Amanda?
Well, it was that same section, and it reminded me of a recent post in one of my groups where a mom of an elementary aged kiddo, similar, the child has been called a prodigy and is very advanced, and she was saying, she's young, but she's hungry and she wants to learn more and she wants mentoring and all of this. And so I'm thinking about doing college level classes, but our local college just won't even talk to me about it because of her age. Like, what should I do? And my take was like, well, maybe instead of trying to get her into college, maybe there's one or two professors there at your local college whose work she really likes and admires, and maybe you can do more of that and create some kind of a mentoring relationship, or possibly a more targeted thing to get around the fact that she's not in college. The number of comments on that article that talked about how they were art school graduates, that they had gone to art school, and how the whole point of art school is to take what you have made and just eviscerate it and to just absolutely shred it so that you learn to do better, and about how an 8 or 9-year-old should not be in that environment. And I was thinking, how about no artist should be in that environment? Like, why is that how we think you're going to learn? Like, why? Just why?
Yeah. And forget and take it beyond artists in anything, right? That it's, this break you down to build you back up mentality, right? Like, how about we just not break other human beings? How about we just nurture and support other human beings? Yeah. Imagine that concept. That's so sad.
Right.
That is terrible. Thankfully, I mean, my child is in a creative college program, and thankfully that has not been our experience. It is a Canadian school, so maybe there's a little bit of a difference there. I'm not really sure. Maybe. But yeah, that's so sad. That's terrible. Yeah, I mean, these little creatives, oh my gosh, throw everything at them. Let them explore that. Let them branch out. Let them try different mediums and genres and all that kind of stuff. It's so important to learning. It's amazing. That's super sad. You know what else is super sad, Amanda? We have reached the end of our episode, but we have to give people a little warning. Next week, we're going to be reading chapters 7 and 8. And spoiler alert, because we've read ahead. Friends, the shit is about to hit the fan in this book next week. So you are not going to want to miss our next book club episode, because in the previous sections, it's been like, oh, I see his point, but maybe I don't agree entirely. Just wait till you get to chapter 8. Just wait. It's going to be a no holds barred conversation next week on John Holt and Pat Farenga's thought process about neurodivergence. So tune in. You're not going to want to miss it.
And I'm going to preface with, if you care about cursing, or if you especially don't want your children to hear it, but you're open to it, next week's book club podcast is not the podcast to play on your speakers. Put your headphones in.
It's an earbuds kind of week. Yeah. Right. Well, and not even that, right? Okay. So yes, cursing is a thing. And, I mean, we're not horrible, but we are adults. And every once in a while, we just
drop an F-bomb.
We like to throw an adjective in there to really accentuate our true feelings. But also, I wouldn't want my kids even hearing what is written in this book.
Yeah.
Because it is such damaging rhetoric that is in chapter 8 that I wouldn't even want my kids hearing that, even though on the flip side of us reading it out loud, then we refute it and say how ridiculous it is and how hateful and ableist and this and that and the other thing, right? They've still heard it. It's still out there. And so anyway you slice it, next week is an earbuds week. It's just pretty gross stuff that they put in this book. So, we hadn't read it beforehand. I mean, we just randomly pick books that are super popular or that people recommend all the time. And it gets juicy next week. So tune in. You won't want to miss it. All right, everyone. Happy homeschooling. Have an awesome rest of your day. And we will see you for next week's episode. We have talk about virtual co-ops in our regular episode. And then the shit will hit the fan in the book club episode. So we will see you next week. Have a great day.